Mercedes just won the first race of the 2026 season in Australia. But that is not the real story. The real story is what happened after the race. Because two teams using the exact same Mercedes engine suddenly realized something shocking. McLaren has the Mercedes power unit. Williams has the Mercedes power unit. And yet in Melbourne, the factory Mercedes team was extracting up to 0.3 of a second more performance from the exact same engine platform. Not a different specification. Not a secret upgrade. The same power unit, but used in a way nobody else fully understands yet. Inside the McLaren garage, engineers started comparing the data. Acceleration traces, energy deployment, hybrid power spikes. And what they found immediately raised alarms. Because every time the Mercedes car exited a corner, the electrical deployment looked sharper, more aggressive, almost perfectly timed. Something that could completely change lap time. Now the situation has escalated. The Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile is reviewing the technical details behind how the Mercedes engine is being used. Teams are questioning whether a loophole exists inside the new 2026 regulations. And McLaren is openly admitting they still do not fully understand how Mercedes extracts that level of performance from the exact same power unit. Which leads to a question that could define the entire championship. Did Mercedes simply build the best engine of the new era? Or did they discover something hidden inside the rules that the rest of the grid has not seen yet? Because if the answer is the second one, the controversy that started in Australia might only be the beginning. And before we break down what engineers discovered in the Melbourne data, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because what we are about to reveal from the Australian Grand Prix changes the entire picture of the 2026 Formula One season. What McLaren discovered after the Australian Grand Prix did not happen during the race. It happened hours later. Inside the engineering rooms, when the telemetry from Melbourne finally started to be analyzed in detail. Because once the race finished, teams gained access to a much clearer picture of what the Mercedes cars were actually doing on track. Speed traces, energy deployment graphs, acceleration curves, thousands of data points from every lap. And when McLaren engineers began overlaying that information with their own data, something immediately stood out. The difference was not just speed. It was timing. Every time the Mercedes car exited a corner, the electrical power arrived at a very precise moment. Not too early. Not too late. Exactly when the rear tires reached maximum grip. That sounds like a small detail. But in Formula One, timing the hybrid power correctly can transform the entire acceleration phase of the car. If the electrical boost comes too early, the tires spin and traction disappears. If it arrives too late, the car loses valuable meters down the straight. But if it arrives at the exact moment the tires hook up to the asphalt, the car launches forward with incredible efficiency. And according to engineers studying the Australian data, that is exactly what the Mercedes seemed to be doing. Lap after lap, corner after corner. Which immediately raised another question inside the McLaren garage. How is Mercedes achieving that level of precision? Because under the new 2026 regulations, the hybrid system has become far more powerful than before. Electrical deployment can reach levels close to 100 kilowatts in certain phases of the lap. That means energy management is now one of the most critical performance factors in Formula One. It is no longer just about engine power. It is about how intelligently that power is delivered. And that is where Mercedes appears to be operating on a completely different level. Andrea Stella explained that McLaren is still learning how the new power unit behaves across different situations on track. The team is collecting data, running simulations, trying different energy deployment maps. But they are still in the discovery phase. In other words, they are reacting to what the engine does. Mercedes, on the other hand, seems to already know. And that difference in understanding can easily translate into several tenths of a second. Especially in qualifying. But here is where the situation becomes even more complicated. Because when analysts compared all the cars using Mercedes engines, the pattern became very clear. The factory Mercedes team was extracting the most performance. Customer teams were not. Which strongly suggests the advantage is not coming purely from the engine hardware itself. Instead, the real difference may lie in something much harder to replicate. Integration. The relationship between the engine, the battery system, the cooling layout, and the software that controls the hybrid deployment. And if Mercedes has spent years refining that integration before the new regulations arrived, then what we saw in Australia might simply be the result of preparation. Preparation that other teams are still trying to catch up with. But there is another layer to this story. A layer that explains why the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile is now paying very close attention to what happened in Melbourne. Because some engineers believe the advantage might not only come from software or integration. It might also come from a very clever interpretation of the new engine regulations, specifically the rules that define how the combustion process inside the engine is allowed to operate. And if that interpretation gives Mercedes even a small efficiency advantage, then the consequences for the entire championship could be enormous. Which is exactly why the technical discussions around the Mercedes engine are now becoming one of the most important stories of the 2026 season. But the moment this theory started spreading inside the paddock, another layer of the story began to emerge. Because the discussion about the Mercedes engine did not suddenly appear after the Australian Grand Prix. It actually started weeks earlier, long before the cars even arrived in Melbourne. Several engine manufacturers had already raised questions about one very specific area of the new regulations: the compression limits of the internal combustion engine. Under the 2026 rules, these limits are tightly defined. But like many technical rules in Formula One, the wording leaves room for interpretation. Small details, engineering decisions, creative solutions that operate exactly on the edge of what the rulebook allows. And according to several sources inside the paddock, Mercedes may have found an extremely aggressive interpretation of those limits. Now that does not automatically mean anything illegal is happening. In fact, quite the opposite. Formula One history is full of innovations that were completely legal, but initially misunderstood by rivals. Double diffusers, blown exhausts, flexible wings. In every era, one team finds something first, and the rest of the grid spends months trying to understand it. The difference this time is that we are at the beginning of a brand new engine era, which means the competitive consequences could be enormous. Because if Mercedes truly discovered a way to extract more efficiency from the combustion process itself, the benefits would extend far beyond straight-line speed. Better combustion efficiency means more usable energy. More energy means more electrical deployment. And more electrical deployment means stronger acceleration out of corners, which is exactly the pattern engineers noticed in Melbourne. But here is where the situation becomes politically sensitive. Because when one manufacturer appears to gain a major advantage at the start of a new regulation cycle, the pressure on the governing body immediately increases. Other engine suppliers begin asking questions. Technical committees start requesting clarifications. Meetings are scheduled behind closed doors. And the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile begins carefully reviewing every interpretation of the rules. That process had already started before the season began, when several meetings were held between engine manufacturers and the governing body to discuss how the compression rules should be applied. At the time, those meetings looked routine. Just another technical clarification before the season opener. But after what happened in Australia, those conversations suddenly look much more important. Because if Mercedes received approval for a specific interpretation of the rules, then everything they are doing could be perfectly legal. Yet still incredibly difficult for other teams to replicate quickly. And that is exactly what is frustrating teams like McLaren and Williams right now. They know the performance exists. They can see it on the track. They can measure it in the telemetry. But they still do not fully understand how Mercedes is unlocking that potential. Which creates a very uncomfortable situation. Because if the advantage comes from something deeply integrated into the engine design, then copying it may take months, maybe even an entire season. And that possibility is starting to make several teams nervous. Because if Mercedes has truly begun the 2026 era with a clear advantage in engine efficiency and hybrid deployment, then the rest of the grid may already be playing catch-up. But the biggest question still remains unanswered. Is the Mercedes advantage coming from a clever interpretation of the rules, or from something even more powerful? A level of system integration that no other team has managed to achieve yet. And if the answer to that question begins to appear in the next few races, the controversy that started in Australia could become the defining story of the entire 2026 championship. And this is where the situation after the Australian Grand Prix becomes even more tense. Because once the race weekend ended, the discussion inside Formula One quickly moved away from pure performance. It became political. Very political. Whenever one team suddenly appears with a technical advantage at the beginning of a new regulation cycle, the rest of the grid reacts almost immediately. Engine manufacturers start asking questions. Technical directors start calling the governing body. And engineers begin studying every single detail of the data they can access. That is exactly what started happening after Melbourne. Because when analysts looked deeper into the performance of the Mercedes-powered cars, one detail kept appearing again and again. The factory Mercedes team seemed able to deploy electrical energy more aggressively without suffering the usual penalties. No overheating. No sudden drop in battery charge. No instability in power delivery. Just consistent, controlled bursts of hybrid power. And that level of stability is extremely difficult to achieve under the new 2026 rules. Which is why some engineers now believe the Mercedes advantage may come from something far more complex than a simple engine setting. It may come from the way the entire system has been designed to work together. The combustion engine, the battery, the hybrid motor, the cooling architecture, and the software that manages the flow of energy throughout the lap. In modern Formula One, those elements cannot be treated separately. They must operate as one single system. And if one team understands that system better than anyone else, the performance difference can become enormous. According to several analyses inside the paddock, this could explain why the Mercedes car looked so comfortable during the race in Australia. The power delivery was smooth. The energy levels remained stable. And the drivers could deploy the hybrid boost exactly when they needed it. That kind of predictability gives drivers confidence. And confidence translates directly into lap time. But here's where the situation becomes even more uncomfortable for teams like McLaren and Williams. Because both teams know the potential of the engine is there. They can see it in the Mercedes factory car. They can measure it in the telemetry. But they still do not fully understand how to extract it themselves. Which means they are racing with the same engine, but without the same knowledge. And knowledge in Formula One is often more valuable than hardware. Especially at the beginning of a new technical era. This is exactly why the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile has started paying very close attention to the discussions surrounding the Mercedes engine. Not because there is proof of any rule violation. At least not publicly. But because the competitive impact of the advantage could be significant. When one team finds a clever interpretation of the rules, the governing body usually studies the situation carefully. They analyze the data.